Hello, welcome to this week's Summer of Animation video on compositing. I've done a few of these videos now, so if you've been following along, you will already know who I am. But if you don't, my name is Alfie, I'm 21 and I'm a 2D visual effects artist at the Mill. I'm pretty excited to make this video specifically because I use Blender a lot, which is what I've been doing in the last few videos, but my actual job role at work is a compositor, so I'm a 2D artist. And so the stuff I'm going to be showing in this video is things that I actually do in my day-to-day job on a regular basis. So what is compositing? I have this dilemma all the time whenever I try and explain my job role to someone that doesn't know what I do, especially friends and family. I usually end up just telling people I'm an editor, but that's not exactly true. According to Google, a compositor is someone who creates the final image of a frame, shot, or sequence. They take different elements like animations, background plates, graphics, and special effects and put them together to make a believable picture. They are responsible for the composition of images and shots. That's a really good definition. So essentially my job is to take all of the stuff that was shot on the set, all of the CGI animation stuff that comes from the 3D department. You might have matte paintings and backgrounds that have been made specifically by the matte painters in Photoshop. And then maybe some outsource work as well, like some rotoscoping that's come back or some cleanup. And I will take all of those pieces into my compositing software, put them together and create what is essentially the final image apart from color grading. There's loads of sub-roles inside of what's technically called compositing. I'm going to treat this more as a general overview of what a 2D artist does as opposed to strictly a compositor, because a lot of the time, even if you are technically a compositor, you'll be doing lots of these other things as well. Some of those things could be things like cleanup, which is the removal of unwanted objects or elements from the frame, such as tracking markers, or we might have people in the background or a tripod or a light stand that was left there by mistake. That's all going to have to go. There's things like rotoscoping. Quite often this will be outsourced unless you work at a really big company that has its own roto department. Rotoscoping is when you draw masks around something in the frame, which allows you to lift it up and isolate it so it's on its own. This is kind of the equivalent of taking a pair of scissors and cutting someone out of a photo so you can put that photo onto something else. This is really common for if you're putting something CG in the scene, because obviously once you take the footage it's all flat, you don't have any actual depth information, but you might want to put the CG object behind somebody. So to be able to do that, you have to have a difference between the background and the foreground, and to do that you tell the computer with a mask which bits need to go in front of the CG object and which bits are in the background. You have set extension, which might be a sky replacement or adding to the existing environment that was shot on set. A lot of the time this is done with green screens, so at a certain point the practical set will cut off, you have a green screen, and then the idea is you remove the green screen and extend the set going on further backwards. Okay, so the basics of compositing. I'm going to go through a few examples first of stuff that I've done fairly recently. This particular example was for an Iron Man short film I made, so I did an Iron Man suit up sequence for my YouTube channel, which looks like this. So obviously the Iron Man suit wasn't there initially. This is a CG render of the suit, and I had a CG render of the arms as well. For this I had to do some rotoscoping because I have these arms, which one of them is in the foreground, which is supposed to be closer to the camera than me. But this one is supposed to be behind me, but you can see the render is going over my arm, whereas my arm should actually be in front of this bit of the claw. So what I had to do is go in and draw some masks around my arm, which allows me to then isolate that, put it back on top of this render. And that looks a little something like this. So I just have this mask, it's really simple. If you're doing a more complex shape, you might have lots of these masks. So for example, if I was doing my whole body, I'd have another one for my bicep, like this. This is a really rubbish example. And it would look something like that. So you'd have obviously a mask for pretty much everything you're trying to cut out. And if I look at what's called the alpha channel, this is like a black and white image that shows the computer what bits to use and what bits not to use. So for this alpha channel, the computer is essentially saying whatever's white you want to cut out, and whatever's black just leave it, it's not going to be visible. And then eventually once all your masks are finished, you can cut it out, and this is my arm isolated on its own, and then I can merge that back on top of this image, and now my arm is in front of the claw. This is a really common technique in compositing, gets done all the time, takes quite a while. If you have a lot of movement, you have to go through and kind of move this pretty much frame by frame, but eventually the result is that you have isolated elements in your shot, and then you can do whatever you want with them really. Then there's the cleanup that I mentioned earlier, like removing things from the shot that you don't want to be there. For this example, when I put the Iron Man suit over myself, my t-shirt was actually clipping through the suit because my t-shirt was baggier than the Iron Man 3D model. So I had to go in and remove parts of my t-shirt and parts of my sleeve as well here. So I made myself super skinny, never need to go on a diet again. And the way you normally go about approaching this is you do what's called cloning. So there's a brush that takes basically a pixel and moves it to another location. So this is me turning that on and off. I actually got rid of my arm as well because once it was in the Iron Man suit, I didn't want my fingers to be sticking out the end or anything if I hadn't perfectly animated the suit over the top. So it was easy just to remove my arm completely. And the way the clone brush works is you literally have these 2 points. The first circle at the top here is where the information is being taken from, and then the second circle is where you're going to actually paint it. So if I was removing this part of my arm, I would probably select a bit of the pillar, a little bit higher up like here, and then you could just paint downwards, and that will clone those pixels and allow you to remove that section of the frame. This is a super common technique for if you're, say, shooting outside and you have some names of some buildings or something you don't want to be recognizable. A lot of the time, a visual effects artist will just paint the names off the building so it's blank. This next example has a little bit of everything in it. I thought I would show this because who doesn't love UFOs? This was a recent challenge that I did at work with some of the other junior 2D artists. We were asked to do a matte painting that involved a sky replacement and adapting at least a couple of the buildings in the shot. So if I flick to what it looked like before, this is the original shot and this is my composited version. So you can see I replaced a lot of the sky, I made a few of the buildings taller, and obviously I put a UFO in it as well for some fun. The software I'm using for this is called Nuke, but at the end of this I'm going to show how to do some of this stuff in Blender as well. If you're really serious about compositing, I'd recommend just skipping Blender and learning Nuke straight away. Nuke's like the industry standard for what everyone uses pretty much for compositing. Blender is actually really good, the compositor's pretty powerful, but I don't personally use it because if you apply for a job somewhere, no one's going to be compositing in Blender. I'm using a non-commercial version of Nuke, which is free, so if you want to learn Nuke, you can actually download this for free and have a play on your own, but the fully licensed version of Nuke is about £7,000. So this kind of flow diagram thing that I have going on here is what's called the node graph, and all of these different rectangles are called nodes, and all of them kind of serve different purposes. So these blue ones are called merge nodes, and they're literally for putting something over another image. So for example, the sky here, I'm just using a merge node, and I'm putting this sky here over the stuff that I shot here, and I'm using this merge node to combine them. If I turn it on and off, that's what the merge node is doing. This blue one is called a grade node. This is where you do all of your color corrections. So if I change some of these settings, you can see it makes the sky a different color. You have things like the rotor paint node, which is what I used to do the cloning earlier. These kind of lavendery colored ones are like transform nodes. So there's an actual transform, which is for moving stuff around like this. And then these are also kind of doing transforms as well. So for example, this one is changing the scale of the image. This one is flipping it, so it's just mirroring it. I'm not going to go through what every single one does because we could be here all day for that. But essentially what you need to know is that this is our footage at the top, and then it goes through this whole process and we apply all these different effects to it, like color corrections and merging things over it. And then at the bottom, you end up with basically your finished output. So let's start looking at some of the individual elements. I kind of went through when I was doing this and made backdrops and all of these with labels on so I can kind of see what they're called and what they're doing. And it's also really handy for demonstrating it like this. So one of the first things I did was the building extensions. Before the building extensions, it looks like this, and then after it looks like this. Pretty simple stuff. I basically just took the top of the buildings from about here and then moved them up a little bit. So I just sort of cloned it. And the way I did that is I literally drew a mask around this section and I made it kind of feather outwards a little bit, which means it has a bit of a fall off, like a gradient. It's not just really harsh. And then I transformed it up and then merged it back over the footage. So before, after, before, after. Then we have the sky replacement. The really tricky thing with sky replacements is finding a sky that matches the environment that you were working in. So obviously if I turn this off, you can see that the sun is sort of setting over here. A lot of the clouds don't have any light on them from underneath because the sun is sitting just above them. And all along the edges of them, you can kind of see the sun is just picking up and it's sort of getting through the less dense parts of the cloud, which looks really nice. So I spent a load of time looking through a load of photos and trying to find a photo that had similar lighting in it already. It's very difficult to kind of paint or fake a sky replacement, so you kind of have to just find something that works or shoot it yourself. I ended up finding this one. It's a pretty similar situation. We've got the sun is setting just off a frame over here somewhere. All the clouds are quite dark underneath because the sun's just above them, like the stuff that I shot. And then what I really liked about this one was it had these clouds here, which were kind of picking up all of that sunlight. So what I did is I flipped it the other way so that the sun is in the correct position, just like in my shot, and then transformed it into place a little bit. I did a bit of painting just to remove the tops of the trees because some of them were sticking out a bit too high and they were showing up in my composite. A little bit of grading just to make the colors match this shot that I was working on. And then I merged that over the top, and that's how it looks with the sky on top. I also had to do a little bit of rotoscoping because if I just merged it over without any masks, this is what happens. And obviously that's not ideal. So what I did is I created this mask for where I wanted the sky to go. So the white areas are where it's going to be put. The gray areas are kind of like a half mix. And then the black areas are where it's basically going to be the original footage and the sky is not going to go over that part. I did this by combining a couple of techniques. I did some rotoscoping, which is the traditional way of just drawing a mask. So I drew a mask for a lot of the buildings like this, for example. And then I also did what's called keying, which is where the computer detects things like contrast and saturation differences and will try and make a mask for you, which a lot of the time is really handy. So for this, I did what's called a luminance key, which basically means the computer is looking at how bright the image is and giving me a mask. And so this is the luminance key I was able to pull of the sky, because obviously the sky is quite a lot darker than most of the buildings in this. So this gave me a fairly good outline. Obviously some of the things like the railings in this would take a long time to draw a mask around individually, so this saved me quite a bit of time. Some of the things like these fine wires are getting lost in the key, so I had to go back and rebuild them, but that's fine. And this is why it's good to combine a few techniques. So I got the key as far as I could on its own, and then once that was as good as I could get it, I started putting the masks of the buildings in to fill in the gaps that the key couldn't quite get. So this is what my eventual mask looks like, and then like I said, once I use the mask on the buildings, the sky can go in the background, but the buildings won't be changed. And then just under that is where I put the wires back on. So if we look over here, you can see the wires went sort of semi-transparent, but if I turn this back on, then I'm restoring the wires there. I just drew a mask for each of the wires, really simple, and then I just ran them through a flat color, and it kind of just replaces that silhouette of the wires over the sky. So that's on and off. Then we've got some cleanup under here. I knew I wanted to take the top of Canary Wharf off and having it being sucked up by the UFO. So I did some clone painting and just took some of the sky and moved it over the top of the building here. You can see it looks a little bit gross. You can see the repeating texture of the clouds, but I had put a lot of stuff back on top of this so you don't actually notice it. And then next up we have some actual CG renders down here. So in Blender I made a really simple model of Canary Wharf, and then I actually put this texture from this piece of footage back onto it, and that render looks like this. And so for this I broke up the top of the building with a fracture modifier, and that's how I got these kind of chunks to fly up in the air. Just turned off the gravity and I let them float up, and then this is the bit of the building that's broken. These two nodes here are just doing a little bit of color correction to get it to match back into the footage that I was working on. After I rendered this and I brought it into Nuke, I thought this edge was a little bit too soft. For a building that had been ripped apart, I think it should have been more jagged. And so I drew a little mask around the top here, and then I used what's called a noise texture, which looks like this, to kind of displace that mask that I made and make it more jagged. And then I used that mask that I'd created to cut out a better edge on the top of the building, so it looks like this. So you can see it's a lot more jagged and it has less of those kind of smooth curves. So I thought that looked a lot better. Then in Blender I also rendered another layer, which was this kind of scaffolding layer. This was supposed to be like the rebar that was left in the building after the concrete had been sucked away. I wanted some kind of metal poles and stuff to be sticking out the top. So I put that render on the inside of the building, which looks really cool. But again, kind of like these edges, I felt it was a little bit too perfect. These lines are still really straight, and for a building that's being ripped apart, you would expect it to be a little bit more disrupted, I guess. So I used what's called a grid warp, and if I turn it on and off, this is what it looks like. The grid warp is just a grid, and then you can kind of take these points and move them around, and that lets you kind of distort the footage. So you can see here I twisted some of them in certain directions to get a little bit more of an organic look to all the bits of scaffolding. And then with all of that stuff done, I merged this back over the top of the footage. So before and after. Then after this, I did a little bit more roto because obviously the corner of the Barclays building is now missing. So I drew a little mask around Barclays, which looks like this, and then cut that out and then put that back on top of the footage. So now that's going back over the top of Canary Wharf. And then this is the UFO render. I essentially just downloaded this model and then just put some lights on it so it had some different variety in the textures. And also adding lights means I can isolate those lights in compositing and do some funky glows and stuff with them, which is always fun. I lit this using a 360 photo that was fairly similar to the sunset conditions that this footage was taken in. So that's where some of these nice red highlights are coming from. It's kind of emulating the sun direction from the sunset. Again, just like Canary Wharf, this has got a load of color corrections that I did to it just to make it sit into the footage a bit better. Then it's got what's called light wrap on it. This is kind of where the light behind something is so intense that you start to see the light bleeding in around the edges, which kind of blends it into the background more. So I added a little bit of light wrap. It's just really subtle. It would probably be better actually if I show it down here and turn it on and off. So this is what the light wrap is doing. If you look at the edges here. Then I did this really cool trick that I see people do quite often, which is where you blur the background loads and then you just merge that over the top of the CGI. And it's fairly subtle. You don't want to do it too strong, otherwise it looks mental. But what this tends to do is kind of capture the general ambient lighting of the whole shot. And when you put it over the top of the image, it kind of sits it in a lot more because it has the general colors of the environment over it. If I turn this on and off, you can see what that's doing. It works really nicely. These two orange nodes are making the ship a little bit softer because it's probably not going to be exactly in focus, especially because it's massive. And also because CG comes out to render are absolutely perfect, whereas camera lenses actually are pretty much never 100% sharp. They're always a little bit soft. It's really subtle, but if I turn it on and off, you can kind of see what it's doing if you look at the edges. It just takes a little bit of that sharpness out, which stops it looking quite so CG. And then down here, I'm just taking some of the grain from the original footage and putting that on top of the CGI so that the grain matches between the two elements. Then I did some stuff with the lights, which I was talking about earlier. I have what's called an emission pass, which I can isolate because Blender knows which parts of the ship are lights and which parts aren't. So in compositing, I can take out a layer that's just the lights, which is really handy. I can put a little bit of a glow on them, make them a little bit of a different color, and then I can put them on top as well. And so that helps to add some intensity and make them feel a little bit more alive. And then I made this kind of cool tractor beam effect, which looks really nice. There's a node in Nuke called God Rays, which kind of does this for you, which is really handy. So I basically drew a circle mask and then used a bit of noise just to break it up a little bit so it's not just a perfect circle. And if I move this point, you can see it actually changes the direction the God Rays go in. So you have a lot of control over it and they're really fun. So I had them coming out the bottom of the ship like this. I made them a lot stronger and quite blue. And then I put those over the footage, which looks like this. Just like earlier, I made a mask so that the blue tractor beam goes behind some of the buildings and it's not in front of the ones in the foreground, which is a really good way of creating some depth to the scene. And then I also added just a little bit of displacement onto the actual tractor beam as well, which just kind of gives it like an energy feel. It's kind of hard for it to translate on one frame because this is just a still, it's not a moving image. But if this was a video file, you would see it kind of rippling a little bit like heat haze. And that was kind of the idea I was going for, was to make it feel like it was nice and powerful. And then the last thing, just a little cherry on top, was I added a little bit of a reflection into the water. I went really subtle with this because you can't actually see the tops of the buildings in the reflection of the water. This is where obviously the shot ends and I can't see the sky in that at all really. I thought originally it would be cool to have a reflection of the ship in the water, but after looking at it I realised that wouldn't be photorealistic at all because you can't even see the sky, so you wouldn't be able to see the ship. But I did just add this very, very subtle hint of blue into the water, which is kind of this gap in the buildings where the tractor beam is going. It's one of those things that if I didn't tell you it was there, you probably would have never have noticed, but all these kind of little details help to really bring a shot together and take it that last 10%. Some other little details like that people tend to do are things like adding the glows to the lights, which I did earlier, or you could add a lens flare maybe. So if I just make a really quick one here, this is a terrible example, but I haven't got a very good lens flare plugin automatically in Nuke. Something like that, just to add a little bit of extra detail. Okay, so I'm going to show you really simply how to do that kind of thing in Blender if you don't want to have to use Nuke. Open up Blender, obviously, go to the compositing workflow at the top. Ignore this is a preset I have, we're going to get rid of all of that stuff. Press F3 and search for image, load in an image, and then go to open and open whatever footage you have. I'm going to bring in the background footage of Canary Wharf. Make sure you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled by going to Preferences, Add-ons, and search for Node Wrangler. It's this one here. Enable this tick box and then you'll have the Node Wrangler installed. And then press Control Shift and click on this image node here. And that's going to basically create it as your backdrop and then you can start to see what you're doing. If you don't have a menu here in the side, press N. It's going to open this menu, go to View, and then you can press Fit and it's going to fit in the whole image into the background. And this is how you start compositing in Blender. I've not really used Blender's compositor that much, to be honest, so I'm kind of figuring this out as I go. But for example, if I wanted to bring in the CGI and merge that over the top, I'd go to Image, add another image, open it up, find where my CGI is saved. So Blender, ship, and then I have all of these channels here. I want to look at RGBA because that's kind of like the default one that will show me the actual footage. I should mention at this point you need to make sure you've rendered an alpha in your render, otherwise it's not going to be able to merge over the top. So we want to combine the two of these. We're going to search for a mix node, add this up here. We're going to plug the background into the top one and the RGBA into the bottom one, and then the alpha into the factor. And if we look at this, boom, we have a spaceship. So that's the basic principle of it. Then if you want to move it around, because obviously it's a little bit smaller than the version I had in Nuke at the moment, you can search for a translate node, or a transform, sorry. Then if you hover over the noodles, you can see it's highlighting the one that it's going to be attached to. So I'm going to attach it to the RGBA noodle, drop it on like that. And then if I change the scale to something like 2, you can see it gets a lot bigger, but it's still being cut out by the same alpha. So we actually have to make the alpha the same size as the image. So then if I set this to like -20, okay, so that's kind of positioned where I want it now. Then we can go and do some extra stuff to make it look even more convincing. So you can add some color corrections, so you can search for a color balance. So then you have controls for lift, gamma, and gain. I predominantly think of gamma as kind of the shadows and gain as the highlights. That's not technically correct, but it's pretty much what it is. So if I wanted it to feel like the ship was above the clouds, I can lift the gamma up a little bit, which kind of gives it that feel there's some atmosphere between the camera and the ship. And you can also change the colors a little bit. So I think the ship is possibly a little bit red compared to the buildings down here. So I'm going to make it a little bit more blue. And you can see already that's starting to look a lot closer to the kind of color tones of the scene overall. I'm going to add a node called an RGB curves node. You can add points to this and create curves that kind of change the brightness or the colors. I'm going to use it to lift the black point up a little bit. So I'm going to get rid of some of those really dark black areas just by lifting up this point down here a little bit. That's way too far. So there you go. I've just done this very, very quickly. It doesn't look as good as the Nuke version, obviously, but that's kind of the process that I go through for compositing. If you go through all of these menus, there's a lot more filters and things you can add to it, like making it a little bit defocused and things like I did in Nuke as well. So if you have a play and make something on your own, if you post it online, use the hashtag Summer of Animation, and everyone involved in this whole project will be able to see what you've done, which would be awesome. I'd love to see what you get up to. Hopefully this video has opened your eyes a little bit to what a compositor does on a day-to-day basis. Thank you very much for watching.